All right, so up in the spare room at Wellspring, leaning into our Able Project videos, Able Practices. We're on E. Specifically, we're talking about community.
Yeah.
So this is sort of like, how do we live together?
Sure. Yeah.
So maybe we can just arc that a little bit in
Yeah.
the biblical narrative.
Yeah, just thinking about like Genesis 1, God creates the world, there's that creation cycle.
Yeah.
It is good, it is good, it is good. It's this
Yeah.
refrain all throughout Genesis 1. The first time, though, that we read that something is not good
Yeah.
is when God looks out and sees that the first human is alone. It's
Yeah.
not good for man to be alone.
Yeah, which is pretty startling.
It's amazing. Yeah,
right?
it's crazy.
Every day it's like, it's good, and then it's like, wait, what just happened?
Totally. Right. And so there's like the red lights on our dashboard should be going off because
Yeah.
this is really crucial that in God's eyes, this is again pre-fall, this is not good
Yeah.
for humanity to be
Before
alone.
sin has entered the world, before all that,
Yes.
it's actually not good, even sinless person,
Totally.
to be on their own.
To be on their own. And so this gets at this idea of to be human is to not just be like a walking individual
good.
like me and God on our own, but it's to live in community with
Yeah.
other humans who image God
Yeah.
and to live in such a way where we're living together, breathing together, doing all of life together in this close connected way. Now, what happens in the biblical story is that when sin enters the world, it creates this rupture and divide
Yeah.
throughout community and creates this aspect where now it begins to be really hard to trust one another in community. So we see this with the Adam and Eve story post-fall. Cain and Abel, the
Yeah,
first...
the first worship story, the first
Yes,
siblings,
totally.
murder.
All these things become like, all these relationships now become fractured. All these aspects of community become much, much harder because sin has now entered the world.
Yeah.
And this keeps kind of spiraling out of control, if you will. Now, as God sort of looks out on humanity, he has a plan to redeem and rescue humans and to bring them back into family and into community. So he calls Abraham and his family to not just be a blessing to kind of his own kind of pod
Yeah.
or community, but to all the communities, all the families of the world, so that we might all kind of come back together and experience.
And he says, in Abraham, he's going to form him into a community.
Yes, totally.
Right? So he doesn't just say, Abraham, you're going to be a blessing to the world.
Totally.
Abraham, through you and your descendants,
Family,
the
yes.
community, the family that I form in you, you guys are going to bless the world.
Exactly. And so as this family is being formed and shaped,
Yeah.
Eventually, kind of tragically, they end up in slavery
Yeah.
in Egypt.
Yeah.
But as kind of God is working and rescuing his people and forming, right, out of Egypt, this new family, this new community,
Yeah.
he gives them all these beautiful practices and habits.
And a lot of them are shared.
They're shared habits,
practices
feasts,
to form,
rituals
them
to,
into a group.
to form family life and community life together, where this is not just ancient Israel meant to live like one-on-one vertically only
Yeah.
before Yahweh their God,
good.
but to live in community together. So all the feasts,
Yeah, and a feast, it's helpful to
Totally,
just
yes,
say
yeah,
this.
yeah.
Like, a feast is not, we sort of think of it as like this like maybe boring religious ceremony
yeah.
we read about, but no, this is like a party.
it's a party, it's a celebration.
So they have national parties
Yes.
on a regular basis that like they get to enjoy one another and God.
In Deuteronomy 14, just kind of even thought of this, there's like an aspect where there's part of their like tithe, so to speak, that's set aside for these like national
Parties.
celebrations and parties, right?
Yeah.
It's part of their structure, it's part
Yeah.
of their society to have these communal kind of formation habits, celebrations, to build this relationship on a horizontal level in honor, in a way that's honoring to God vertically
That's good.
as well. Now, again, as the story sort of continues, we see that as sin kind of creeps in more and more in the family of Israel, things start to break apart, fall apart. Eventually, as Israel's in the promised land, the family gets divided. So you have the northern and southern
Yeah.
kind of kingdoms,
Which
if
is
you
like
will.
right after Solomon and David.
Exactly,
I mean,
right?
Really quick.
So again, the fracturing of family, the fracturing of community happens because sin and pride and all sorts of things
And
kind of creep
exile.
in. Exile comes in.
Yeah.
But through sort of like the Psalms and the prophets, there's this, again, forward-looking hope that God would kind of bring back Israel and reform Israel into another beautiful community. Psalm 68 has this great line where it says, the psalmist writes, God sets the lonely in families. And I think even about as ancient Israel kind of looking out, wondering like what has happened to us in exile, what has happened to us in our family, that God's heart is to set the lonely, not just in ancient Israel's time, but in our time as well, where we have a ton of loneliness, ton of sort of isolation, to bring the lonely into his family.
good.
And so as we look at the ministry and life of Jesus, this is exactly we see Jesus doing, among other things, bringing the foreigner, the outcast, the lonely into the family of God,
Well, because as
into
modern
community.
Christians, often we think, oh, I just need a personal relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely,
Amen.
totally.
But Jesus doesn't just meet with people one-on-one.
Yeah, totally.
He forms a community.
Yes.
That's one of the first thing he does. He calls disciples, forms into a community, does life with them,
Yes.
trains and equips them, sends them out communally,
For sure.
brings them out, right? After he dies and is resurrected, right? He sends the community,
Community
out,
out, yes.
to be his witnesses in the world.
For sure. I even think about, even in Jesus' teachings, where one of the famous parables that we have is the parable of the lost sheep.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I've done this too, we kind of view it through this lens of, oh yeah, that's God coming after me as an individual.
And what does he do?
What does he do,
brings
though?
the sheep back to the fold
To
and they throw a party.
throw a party, right? So it's all about taking that lonely individual
Sure.
and that lost individual and bring them back into the family, the community,
Totally.
and to have this communal aspect, this communal way of living in the
good.
family of God. Now, this kind of continues more and more as Jesus descends or ascends back to the Father.
Yeah.
The pouring of the Spirit, Acts chapter 2. We have then the formation of the church,
Yeah.
right? And it's a community. It's a group of people from various backgrounds
Totally.
ethnically. And what we see in Acts 2:42 and following, they're breaking the bread, they're
Sharing
possessions, all these sorts of things where
praying together, attending temple
Yes.
together, like they're spending time together.
time together. And again, it's one of those things where you read through the book of Acts, you just can't help but notice how much of Paul's own ministry team is communal. It's not just him doing these missionary journeys, it's with a team of people together.
Heavily invested in the people there.
Exactly,
too.
for sure. And so there is this aspect where even as he's forming these new communities of leadership structures, it's all these sorts of things, right? Where it's the community at large that is one of the primary focuses for Paul and the early church. Even to the point where as Paul's writing his letters, and this is something I think even for us today we have to pay attention to. He's writing to the church in Ephesus, for example. So many times that pronoun you is always in those letters.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that most, if not all of those yous are plural.
Yeah, for the community.
For the community, right? So we have the thing where we have to read our New Testament and just kind of pay attention that Paul is writing these to a community. Yes, that applies to me individually, but it applies to me individually in the aspect of my life within
I'm
the
a part
broader
of this
community. Exactly.
It's also true just in their world.
Yeah.
We are like 1,000 times more individualistic. So every time we read the scriptures, we're also reading a document that was formed within a people group
Yes.
that have a communal worldview.
Yeah, way different worldview as far as, we have very highly individualistic worldview for better or for worse, like you're saying, a more communal worldview, which I think there's a lot to that. Even to the point where one of the main ways that Paul describes the church is through the language of brothers and sisters. It's family language, right? And even thinking about so many of what we might consider like theological issues in Paul's letters are really kind of breakdowns within community that he wants to address pastorally and theologically. So all of like the craziness in the church in Corinth is problems within the community that Paul wants to seek to address pastorally and theologically.
And even one of the primary images Paul gives of the church is a body.
A body, yeah, totally.
Which is a unitary, a sort of a one thing composed of many
parts. Exactly.
And
Paul
that's
even
sort
says
of
that.
his, very frame that and then we need each other.
We need each other, and we need each other's whether to push back, to learn to grow, all these sorts of things. As we follow Jesus, like you've said before, it's not just about a personal relationship. It is that, but it's about so much more. Living life in community together, to the point where when we look at the end of the biblical storyline, what we see is that God has brought together people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. We're all collectively together worshiping the Lamb who's on the throne. And we're living in the new heavens and new earth as a community with God on the throne.
That's good.
Yeah.
And so applying this sort of pastorally and personally, where does it hit the ground?
Yeah, I think for me, just recognizing, first off, we live in a very individualistic culture. So it's almost like fish in water, right? Where individualism
David
is sort
Foster
of
Wallace,
totally right. It's like the air we breathe to a certain extent.
So when we read the New Testament, we read that you as individual versus plural. Like we just approach it,
and we have to be cognizantly aware of that and push against that. I think to more than I think sometimes we're comfortable with. So I think that's the first thing, just being aware of that and pushing against some of that individualism. I think secondly is just being sort of cognizant and aware of. Sometimes I think of a community, we have like this ideal of it's going to be amazing
People
and
are gonna
easy.
love me
Totally.
and,
And it's just going to be, like no drama.
I'm gonna like everyone.
I'm going to like, exactly. And to push
which is
against.
not a promise.
Never
You
in
will
Scripture.
never read it in the
just read the
Scriptures.
New Testament, right? There's always problems within community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, from about a century or so ago, wrote during World War II, those who love their dream of Christian community more than they love Christian community itself become destroyers of that Christian community.
Because they take that idea,
right?
and they say, this is what it should be.
And they
if
impose
it's
it
not,
on everyone else.
then you just sort of undermine your corrosive influence.
Yeah, so I think just secondly then, just to push against, or be aware at the very least, some of the idealism that we might carry as we come into community. And I think kind of thirdly, if we're talking about kind of pushing against individualism, pushing against idealism, I think also number 3, just commit. There's a level of community where community takes commitment.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard in our culture. I think personally, we've seen and experienced this with some of our friends in our own sort of well community where we have committed, like unless we're sick, we're going to be together every Tuesday night. Yeah. And over the course of a couple of years, it's formed these beautiful relationships and trust and community where so much of it, like 90% of it maybe, is just about showing up and committing and maybe reorganizing your schedule a bit to prioritize. This is what it is. It's to prioritize, to inconvenience yourself to a certain extent, to say living in community is really, really important.
Yeah, that it's central to the Christian life.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the other things I sort of think of more maybe practically or pastorally are just, I think sometimes we disconnect community from growth.
Yeah.
Right, Jesus talks about how, there's people that walk around with a log in their eye. Yeah. And they're like hitting people and they're focused on the splinter in someone else's. But I think one of the ways we recognize when we have a log in our eye is we're in community. Yeah. And people say, I've hung out with you for the last 2 years at this well community, and you're like, you have a log in your eye.
Totally.
You're smacking people.
Totally. Yeah.
Like, you're hitting people.
You're whacking people and you don't even know it. Yeah,
you don't even know it. I also think, that often, and I don't necessarily have a verse for this, but experientially what I've noticed is people that are wounded in community, God almost always heals through community.
Yeah.
So like, it's great. We can go to therapy. We can do that. We can work on it. But often the deepest healing happens in communal environments and in relationship.
Yeah, for sure.
Also just want to sort of say that, I had a note here, just 2 things. One is also just life is hard.
Yeah.
And, Paul talks about weird sort of community exists so we can bear one another's burdens in Galatians. And I think that's like, community is not something we just commit to, but also something that like we get something out of.
Totally. Oh, yeah.
I also want to just highlight that like when we go back to Genesis 1, sometimes we think of community as purely like this insular thing.
No,
like, I'm just going to protect my friends and my people, but actually it's an integral part of our outward witness.
Yeah.
So Genesis 1, right, when it says human beings are created in the image of God, it says male and female. Fundamentally, it's a community that witnesses to a communal God.
Exactly.
So you have 3-in-1 God. The witness, the image bearer, is a community.
Yeah.
Men and women. And I think that then translates into the New Testament when Jesus says, right, they will know you by how you love one another.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is a communal frame, right? Like, by the way we love and treat and connect and live in community to one another, we witness to the King and the Kingdom.
Totally, yeah, for sure. I think that's really crucial to understand that, is that, again, this is back to Genesis 1 and what you're just saying. What it means to be human is to live in relationship, live in community. And we're imaging God, who is Father, Son, Spirit, triune, a community to an extent, right? And to live into that as Jesus forms us and shapes us as a community of his disciples.
Yeah,
so,
it's good.
Yeah.